Ah, son, listen to me. Today I'm going to tell you a story about men who came from beyond the foggy seas, competing with storms. They were the ones who spoke to the waves, listened to the whispers of the wind, and were born in the harsh lands of the north. The Vikings. These men didn't just change the course of history with their swords, but with their courage. With their ships that crossed oceans, they raided monasteries, shook kingdoms, built cities, and shaped the destiny of an entire age. In the dark days of Europe, when the silhouettes of Viking longships appeared on the horizon, coastal people were struck with an indescribable fear. But their story wasn't just about blood and gunpowder. They opened trade routes, encountered new cultures. Some became the guardians of emperors, while others built civilizations in brand new lands. Today, I'll take you back to those days when the salty scent of the wind filled your lungs and the sound of swords echoed. Close your eyes and imagine. A storm is coming from the north. Are you ready? Kid, history is like a long river. Sometimes its waters flow calmly, and other times it rises suddenly like a flood, sweeping everything in its path. The year 793 was one of those turning points. That year, ships from the dark horizons of the north reached the peaceful shores of Europe, shaking the very foundations of the old world. The Lindisfarne monastery looking out over the endless blue of the sea. It was a place dedicated to God, full of prayer and worship in the north of England. While the monks prayed in peace and sacred hymns echoed through the wooden walls, suddenly the northern wind brought a sense of doom. The long ships appearing on the horizon with their narrow hulls and prow figures shaped like fierce bird heads seemed to have come not from the world, but from a dark legend. Like black shadows approaching the shore, the Viking warriors, when they saw the monastery's stone walls, didn't think they were at the borders of a sacred place, nor did they plan to show mercy to those inside. To them, this was a treasure filled with gold and silver, an unprotected, defenseless prey. The church bells fell silent in the midst of screams. The wooden doors were shattered by heavy axes, and holy books were stained with blood and scattered on the ground. Some monks prayed for salvation while others collapsed, struck down by swords. This wasn't just an attack, it was the herald of an era. The people of Europe had never seen anything like this. As the news of what happened in Lindisfarne spread from mouth to mouth, kings, lords, and priests trembled in fear. Who were these men? Where had they come from? And most importantly, when would they come back? And so, kid, that's how the Viking Age began. With blood, fire, and fear. And once these northern warriors set sail, nothing could stop them. Kid, as you get older, you start to realize that to understand a people, you can't just look at what they've done, but where they came from as well. When you think of the Vikings, you've got to turn your eyes north, to the cold, harsh, and unforgiving lands. Scandinavia is a place where winter lasts long and the land is stingy. The lakes, deep forests, and mountains covered in ice shape this region's nature, and the people living here had to be strong just to survive. The land wasn't suited for farming, so the sea was their destiny. The children of the north learned to build ships, row, and fight the waves from a young age. Fishing, hunting, and of course raiding, these were all a part of their everyday life. But the Vikings weren't just raiding warriors. They were also craftsmen, traders, and explorers. Their society was built on a strong clan structure. Every community had a jarl, a leader. The clans were bound by blood, but that bond wasn't just a legacy from the family tree. It was a title earned through courage, loyalty, and bloodshed. A Viking could only prove his strength and honor on the battlefield. They were deeply connected to their pagan beliefs. Odin, the god of war and wisdom. Thor, the protector who shook the skies and defeated giants. Valkyries, who chose the brave warriors fallen in battle and took them to Valhalla. For a Viking, death wasn't the end, it was just the beginning. What mattered was how you lived and how you died. Only those who died with a sword in hand could join the great battles of the afterlife and live in glory. That's why they feared death so little. But what made the Vikings truly who they were wasn't just their courage or their fighting skills. No, what turned them into Europe's most feared power was their mastery of the seas. Their shipbuilding skills were far beyond their time. The Drakkar, dragon-headed longships, were their greatest weapon. With their narrow and long designs, they could withstand the rough waves of the oceans and slip into shallow rivers. A Viking fleet could cross rivers and make it right into the heart of cities, striking from the most unexpected places. A Viking ship appearing on the shore in the morning could, within hours, turn a monastery into rubble and vanish into the horizon with its loot. The Gnar ships, on the other hand, were built for trade. The Vikings weren't just warriors, they were master traders too. These ships carried goods from the Baltic to the Black Sea and even all the way to Baghdad. Amber, furs, slaves. A Viking's hand held more than just a sword, it also held trade. So why did the Vikings strike so much fear into people? Because they changed the rules of war. Europeans thought battles were fought in an orderly fashion with armies meeting face to face. But the Vikings didn't choose the battlefield. They came at night, quietly slipped to the shore, and attacked when their enemies were most vulnerable. Raids. That was their greatest tactic. Cities, towns, monasteries. Any place caught unprepared, defenseless, was their prey. They'd appear suddenly on the shore and disappear into the streets, lost in fires and screams. For a European lord, not knowing whether the Vikings would come to raid their land was the worst nightmare, because when they came, no one could stop them. And the scariest part? Those who thought they could stop them with gold were gravely mistaken. Some kings tried to make peace with the Vikings by offering them gold and silver. But all that did was encourage more raids, because when the Vikings caught the scent of gold, all they wanted was more. So, kid, the Vikings weren't just warriors, they were the masters of the seas. They were Europe's nightmare, and that nightmare would last for centuries. Kid, you remember how I told you the Vikings weren't just sailors, they were masters of war too? They were men shaped by storms with minds as sharp as their swords and ships. And now, let me tell you about how a group of those brave men brought terror to the shores of England. The first major raid on Lindisfarne had already sent shock waves through Europe. The cries of the monks mixed with the roar of the sea, and the stone walls were stained with blood. But this was just the beginning. When the Vikings realized how vulnerable the land they had discovered was, they seized the opportunity. The rich and fertile lands of England now lay before them, ripe for the taking. After Lindisfarne, the Vikings couldn't stop. Northumbria, a powerful kingdom in northern England, was torn apart by internal strife. The battles for the throne had weakened the kingdom, and for the Vikings, there couldn't have been a better opportunity. The axes that had fallen at Lindisfarne in 793 went on to strike the Jarrow Monastery in 794, and by the end of the 8th century, the Vikings hit Wearmouth and other coastal towns. These northern warriors were not swayed by walls or prayers. But the Vikings didn't stop with Northumbria. They set their sights southward. Mercia, a strong kingdom, was vulnerable along its coast. The Vikings sailed up the Thames River, raiding Mercian lands. The rivers were their secret highways. They came from the oceans, glided through the shallow rivers, and one morning, the people awoke beneath the shadows of Viking shields. And of course, there was Wessex. At that time, Wessex was a rising kingdom in the southwest of England. But the Vikings knew that only the strong survived. The ports of Wessex were flooded with Viking ships, the cities were plundered, and the people scrambled for safety. The first Viking axe to strike Wessex was a message to the English kings. We have arrived, and we're not leaving. So, what did these English kings do? How did they try to stop the Vikings? Ah, kid, the truth is the English were not ready for this new enemy. They were used to traditional warfare, big armies meeting in open battles. But the Vikings didn't fight that way. They'd show up suddenly, burn and pillage, and then vanish back into the sea. When King Aethelred of Northumbria confronted the Vikings, he thought they were just common raiders. But instead, he faced an organized, disciplined, and fast-moving force. When he gathered his men and marched against them, he was stunned to find the enemy was gone by the time he arrived. The Vikings had already raided and left behind nothing but burned villages, fields filled with bodies, and the trail of stolen treasure. King Offa of Mercia thought he was the strongest ruler in England, but when the Vikings reached his land, his soldiers were inadequate, his cities unprotected. Offa's famous Offa's Dyke, built to defend his borders, was useless against these northern sailors. The Vikings weren't coming from the land, they were coming from the sea. King Ecgbert of Wessex became one of the few rulers to hold his ground against the Vikings. But sadly, his victory didn't last. When the Vikings were repelled, it didn't mean they had given up. They didn't retreat. They were simply regrouping, getting ready to return stronger. And here, kid, is where the English kings made their biggest mistake. They thought of the Vikings as mere raiders. When they beat them once, they thought they were done with them. But the Vikings weren't ready to leave. They were no longer looking at England. They were looking to their future. Kid, this was just the beginning of the war. The struggle between England and the Vikings would go on for years. Kingdoms would fall and new heroes would rise. But one thing was certain. The warriors of the north were taking steady steps to bring down one of Europe's greatest civilizations. Kid, I told you about Lindisfarne, the first Viking raid, the screams of the terrified monks and the smoke rising over English lands. But that was only the beginning. On that day, the men of the north had landed on European shores as mere raiders. But the story I'm about to tell you shows that now they had become conquerors. For in the year 865, the storm that came from the sea was not just a small raid, but something that would shake kingdoms. This is the tale of the Great Viking Army, not a few hundred men, but thousands of warriors who came to conquer England. And the leaders of this army were no ordinary warriors, no. They were sons of a fearless fighter, a man known throughout the Viking world. Yes, kid, the man I speak of is Ragnar Lodbrok. His name was known far and wide. His courage, his brutality, and the terror he unleashed on English soil became the stuff of legends. But fate was cruel to him. He fell into the hands of an English king and met a horrific end, thrown into a pit of snakes. And it is here that the story truly begins. For with Ragnar's death, the Vikings did not retreat. On the contrary, there were men sworn to avenge him, men who had promised to pay with blood and conquest, Ragnar's sons. It was the year 865. The winters of the north were harsh, but for the Vikings, the greatest storm was the fire of vengeance burning in their hearts. Ragnar's sons, Ivar the Boneless, Ube, Itzark, and Sigurd, gathered a vast army and set their sights on England. But this time they weren't coming as mere raiders. This time the Vikings were coming not to plunder, but to conquer. Thousands of warriors packed into ships, sailing from the northern seas toward England's eastern shores. The waves carried these men never to return. Until that day, the Vikings would strike coastal villages, burn cities, and withdraw. But now, this army would not turn back. They wanted England for themselves. This massive army landed on the shores of East Anglia. King Edmund had no army capable of stopping such a force. He paid the Vikings tribute, gave them horses, and directed the Great Viking Army northward. The Anglo-Saxon kings were divided by internal strife and could not unite. So, the Vikings pressed forward, step by step, heading for their greatest prize, Northumbria, and its capital, York. York, an ancient city, its stone walls a fortress in themselves. But even this city could not withstand the violence of war. In 866, Ragnar's sons besieged York. The king of Northumbria at the time, Ella, did everything he could to defend the city. But the Vikings were masters at breaching walls. For the Vikings, war wasn't just about swords. They fought with intellect and tactics. They studied York's defenses, found its weakest points, and coordinated their attack perfectly. And on November 1, 866, York fell. But the true horror began after the city fell. Because here it wasn't just about conquest, it was about revenge. King Eal was seen as the man responsible for Ragnar Lodbrok's death. And Ragnar's sons decided to make him pay in a way that would never be forgotten. They gave him the punishment of the blood eagle, one of the Vikings' most horrific methods of execution. Eal's back was cut open, his ribs were spread, and his lungs were pulled out to form wings. This wasn't just an execution, it was a message. If you kill a Viking, this is your fate. The fall of York was the greatest sign that the Vikings were not just here to raid England. Now, they intended to make it their home. The capital of Northumbria had fallen into their hands, and from there, they would spread throughout all of England. The fall of York wasn't just a disaster for Northumbria. It was a disaster for all of England. The Vikings didn't stop there. East Anglia, Mercia, Wessex, all were under threat. The Anglo-Saxon kings would have to put aside their feuds and unite against the Vikings. But the Vikings didn't fight traditional battles. They thrived on chaos and speed. The Great Viking Army began to carve up England, one piece at a time. But kid, remember, no matter how powerful an army is, no army is invincible forever. The Anglo-Saxons would learn how to fight this new enemy, and one of the greatest resistances in history would soon begin. But that, my son, is a story for another time. Ah, my child, how strange is the twist of fate. The Viking raiders who once came from the ruthless seas of the north, their swords staining the shores with blood, would eventually transform into the most powerful nobles of Europe. Yes, today I will tell you the story of how the mighty warriors of the seas became the lords of grand palaces. And this story begins with the name of a single man, Rollo. Britain was a tempting target for the Vikings, wasn't it? The rivers, the rich monasteries, the divided kingdoms. But remember, my child, the Vikings didn't just shake England. They had shaken all of Europe. The Frankish kingdom, which controlled what is now France, had been dealing with Viking raids for years. The Seine River in particular had become the favored route for warriors coming from the north. Along its waters, raiders would advance, burning cities and looting wealth. And unfortunately, the Frankish kings were not very successful in stopping them. In particular, in 845, Viking leader Ragnar Lodbrok, with a fleet of 120 ships, sailed up the Seine and laid siege to Paris. Imagine that, my child, one of Europe's greatest cities, Paris, known for its cathedrals, massive stone walls, churches, and marketplaces, had to surrender to the Vikings. King Charles the Bald paid a great amount of gold to make them leave. However, this bribe only emboldened the Vikings. Year after year, more warriors with bigger fleets sailed down the Seine, raiding Frankish lands. And among these raiders, one man would enter history in a completely different way. Rollo. Rollo, my child, was no ordinary Viking. His name was spoken with both fear and respect. He was tall, broad, and said that even horses struggled to carry him. He was a raider, but he was also a leader. He sailed into the north of France, making the lands along the Seine his home. Rouen came under Viking control. These places were no longer just sites of fleeting raids, they were becoming permanent settlements. King Charles III of the Franks had grown tired of the Viking raids. His army was incapable of completely wiping out Rollo's men. Moreover, the Vikings were becoming masters of not only war, but also politics. Rollo proved that he wasn't just a raider, but a leader capable of governing lands. And so in the year 911, one of history's most interesting treaties was signed, the Treaty of Saint-Clair-sur-Ete. With this treaty, King Charles III officially made Rollo the Duke of Normandy. Yes, you heard right, my child. A Viking, once a raider, was now part of the European nobility. In return, Rollo's only obligation was to swear loyalty to the king and defend his lands from Viking raiders. And thus, in the north of France, a new homeland was born for the Vikings, Normandy. But this is where the fate of the Vikings began to change. From this moment on, the Normans were no longer just warriors, they were rulers and nobles. Rollo and his men didn't stop at just owning land. They had become part of the Frankish nobility. Viking traditions began to intertwine with Frankish laws. One of the greatest changes was the matter of religion. The Franks were a Christian people, and Rollo's Normans had to adapt to this new order. This was not just a spiritual transformation, but a power move. Christianity played a crucial role in Europe's political order. A baptized leader could be more easily accepted by other kings. Instead of being seen as barbarians who burned churches, the Vikings were on the path to becoming a powerful part of Europe. And so over time, the Normans began to leave their Viking identity behind. But remember, my child, a Norman never completely forgets his true identity. Viking blood still ran through their veins. They retained some of their old traditions, their seafaring skills, their warrior mentality, and their strong leadership. But now they were nobles. They built stone castles, formed great armies, and would one day create their own kingdoms. Rollo's conquest of Normandy didn't just change France, it changed all of Europe. His descendants would not stay confined to these lands, but would shake the entire continent. So, my child, do you know where we'll see the true power of the Normans? In England, yes. One day, a Norman leader, descended from Rollo, would set his sights on the throne of England and lead one of history's greatest invasions. Ah, my child, the story of the Vikings was not only written in the West, in the green valleys of Britain and the Frankish lands. No, their adventures didn't stop at staining those shores with blood. The Vikings also looked to the east. There, vast forests, endless rivers, and great trade routes awaited them. Now I will tell you how the Vikings shaped Eastern Europe and Byzantium. In the east, they were known as the Varangians. These men were not only famous for their swords, but also for their role as traders. They didn't just sail with axes in hand. Their ships were laden with furs, spices, and silver, and they traded along these paths. You can still trace their footsteps today, deep within the lands of Russia and Ukraine. These were sailors of Scandinavian origin. They would depart from what is now Sweden, cross the Baltic Sea, and follow the Volga and Dniester rivers, making their way into the heart of Eastern Europe. These rivers were like trade highways at the time. They would sail up a river, row their boats, and when they reached land, they would carry their ships on their shoulders, moving from one river to the next, continuing their journey south, always with their eyes set on the mighty Byzantium. But before they could conquer Byzantium, they had to establish their own kingdoms in Eastern Europe. That's when a man named Rurik stepped onto the stage. According to legend, in the 860 sus, the Eastern Slavic peoples were embroiled in constant warfare. Tired of their internal conflicts, some of the tribes decided to seek a strong leader and turned their gaze to the north, to the lands of the Vikings. "Let us have a king who will lead us," they said, "and put an end to our quarrels." And so they called upon a Viking warrior named Rurik to lead them. Rurik, along with his men, arrived at the city of Novgorod. This city would soon become one of the greatest trade centers of the north, and thus the foundation of the Rurikid dynasty was laid. After Rurik's death, his descendants moved southward. In 882, Rurik's successor Oleg conquered Kiev and declared it the new capital. The Kievan Rus was born. And my child, here is where the course of history changed. For the Kievan Rus was not just made up of Vikings. Here, Slavs, Turkic tribes, and Scandinavian warriors lived side by side. A great state, connecting the East and the West, had been born. Kiev became one of Eastern Europe's most powerful centers. The Varangians were not just warriors, they grew wealthy through trade, formed alliances with Byzantium, and embraced Christianity. and thus the Vikings in Slavic lands transformed into rulers and princes. So what happened next? Well, that's another great story, my child, because the Vikings didn't just become the masters of Russia. They set their sights on Byzantium, on Constantinople, and now I will take you to that enchanting city. Ah, Constantinople, that captivating city which for centuries adorned the dreams of every warrior. New Rome, queen of the world, the city of 7 hills. Have you ever thought that a Viking could become the emperor's bodyguard? Well, now I will tell you the story of the Varangian Guard. My child, you know that the Vikings were always searching for new routes. As they moved eastward, the Volga and Dniester rivers led them directly to the Black Sea. From there, they reached the famous walled city of Constantinople. In the year 860, the first Viking ships arrived on the shores of Byzantium. And it was then that the Byzantines realized how powerful these northern giants truly were. The Byzantine emperors would call their most loyal soldiers the Varangian Guard. But who were these warriors? They were mercenaries from Scandinavia, the Kievan Rus, and even Anglo-Saxon England. When they swore their oaths, they promised to remain loyal to the Byzantine emperor until death. For the Varangians were not ordinary mercenaries. They were fierce, loyal, and incredibly skilled. They were strong, towering men, masters of the axe. Their primary weapon was the Danax, a long-handled, double-headed axe. With one blow, they could split a man in two. This is why in the palaces of Constantinople, they were regarded as the elite of the elite. Especially in 988, when the ruler of the Kievan Rus, Vladimir the Great, made an agreement with the Byzantine emperor. Thousands of Viking warriors entered the service of Byzantium. From that day forward, the Vikings were no longer just raiders who struck fear into the seas, but the most loyal guards in the imperial palaces. My child, the stories tell us that the Varangian guards were not just warriors. They were the silent shadows of the Byzantine palaces. Imagine if one day an emperor faced treason or danger, the Varangians would not hesitate to protect him. It is even said that when a new emperor ascended the throne, they would seal the treasure chambers and not move the gold and jewels until they had sworn their loyalty to the new ruler. And one day, the descendants of the Varangian Guard would once again step onto the stage of history. The bloodline of these Vikings would return to England and lead an empire to conquer new lands. But my child, this story does not end here. There is another tale as remarkable as the Vikings' adventure in Byzantium. The Normans, the most powerful legacy of the Vikings, were yet to come. Ah, kid, the Vikings didn't just set out to fight. Their minds were as sharp as their swords. They weren't just raiding barbarians. They were traders, sailors, and even founders of kingdoms. Now I'll take you from the misty northern seas to the coasts of Ireland and Scotland. The Vikings didn't just raid here. They built kingdoms, founded cities, and blended with the Celtic peoples. Then we'll dive into the Vikings' trade routes. Because the Vikings ruled not just the battlefield, but the trade routes as well. The trade networks stretching from the Baltic Sea to Byzantium, from England to Baghdad, changed the fate of Europe. Kid, close your eyes and imagine this. The early 800s. Northern winds are crashing against Ireland's rocky shores. Through the fog, longships appear. After raiding the British coasts, the Vikings set their sights on the northern parts of Ireland and Scotland. At first, they raided monasteries and villages, just like they did at Lindisfarne. But over time, the Vikings realized the wealth these lands offered. These weren't just places to plunder, they were lands to settle. And so the Vikings started to build cities in Ireland. In 841 AD, the Vikings founded one of Ireland's first major settlements, Dublin. This place, which is now a large city, was actually built by the Vikings. It wasn't just a port, it was also a trade center and a military base. The Vikings turned Dublin into one of Europe's largest slave markets. Yes, kid, the Vikings were masters of the slave trade. They'd capture people from here and sell them as far as Britain, the Frankish lands, and even Andalusia. But the Vikings didn't stop at Dublin. They also founded cities like Limerick, Waterford, Cork, and Wexford. These cities became Viking trade hubs. Over time, Vikings and native Irish intermarried, and their cultures blended. But the Vikings didn't stop with Ireland. They pushed further north to the wild lands of Scotland. Kidd, northern Scotland, cold, harsh, and unforgiving. This was exactly the kind of place the Vikings loved. The Hebrides, the Orkney Islands, and Shetland, all of these islands were conquered by the Vikings. By 875 AD, the Vikings had established permanent settlements on these islands. The local people, the Celts and Picts, began living side by side with the Vikings. The Vikings didn't just spread their own culture, they also adopted Celtic traditions. Eventually, the Vikings became so powerful in Scotland that the Orkney and Hebrides Islands became Viking lordships. These lordships were loyal to the kings of Norway, but over time, Scottish kings began pushing the Vikings out of these lands. Still, the Vikings' legacy lives on in Ireland and Scotland. There are still people in certain areas who can trace their ancestry back to the Vikings. And Kidd, if you look at the names of these lands, you can still see the Vikings' mark. Now let's take a look at what the Vikings were up to beyond just war and conquest. Because the Vikings weren't just warriors, they were traders too. Kidd, imagine the journey of a Viking trader. He leaves a port in the Baltic Sea early in the morning, his ship loaded with furs and amber. A few weeks later, he's trading at a market in England, swapping his goods for silver. Then he boards his ship again, riding the northern winds toward the Frankish lands, and even all the way to Byzantium. Yes, the Vikings were not just raiders, they were some of the bravest traders the world had ever seen. So what did the Vikings trade? Furs, they carried the finest furs from Siberia. Amber, the golden amber from the Baltic Sea, was highly valued in Europe. Weapons and armor, Viking craftsmen made strong swords and armor. Spices from the east were worth a fortune in Europe. Slaves, the Vikings were experts in the slave trade. They'd capture people and sell them all over Europe. Where did the Vikings go on their trade routes? Kidd, you can trace the Vikings' paths from the Baltic to Byzantium, from England to Baghdad. The western route. England, the Frankish lands, and Ireland. The eastern route. The rivers of Russia, leading all the way to Byzantium. The southern route, a path that stretched to North Africa and Andalusia. The trade with Byzantium and the Abbasids was one of the Vikings' biggest sources of wealth. Kidd, don't just see the Vikings as bloodthirsty warriors. They were traders, explorers, and state builders. They founded cities in Ireland, blended with the people of Scotland, and opened up trade routes. And that legacy still lives on. But the Vikings' adventure doesn't stop here, because one day the Vikings would set sail for a new world. Ah, son, time changes everything, my child. The Vikings, once nothing more than fearless raiders from the seas, had now become rulers sitting on thrones. They began using their swords not just for war, but to create laws and govern their people. And the person I'm going to tell you about today, he was probably the greatest Viking ruler of them all, King Canute the Great. His name was as strong as the waves. He established a vast empire covering England, Denmark, and Norway. But his story isn't just about conquests. It's about his wise leadership and strategic mind. Now let me take you back 1,000 years. It's the year 1013. King Sweyn Forkbeard of Denmark had long dreamed of conquering England. The Viking raids had worn down and weakened the English kingdoms. Finally, Sweyn gathered a massive fleet and set sail for England. King Aethelred the Unready had to flee, and England came under Viking control.
But fate is cruel, my child. Only weeks after Sweyn took the throne, he died. That's when all eyes turned to his son, Canute. but the English called back the exiled king Ethelred and gave the throne back to him. Canute had to reclaim his father's legacy. For him, it wasn't just about conquest, it was a matter of honor. In 1015, Canute gathered a great army. With Danish warriors, Norwegian allies, and old Viking mercenaries, he set out on a bloody campaign to take England.
The new King of England, Edmund Ironside, fought back against the Vikings. After months of battles, two major clashes took place, Stamford Bridge and the Battle of Ashington. Canute's army ruthlessly crushed their enemy. Finally, in 1016, with Edmund's death, Canute became the sole ruler of England. England was now ruled by a Viking king, but Canute's plans were much bigger. He didn't just want to be the King of England. Child, winning wars is tough, but ruling a kingdom is even tougher. Canute, not just with his sword, but also with his clever mind, built an empire. His first order of business was to neutralize the anti-Viking nobles in England. He replaced them with loyal Danish lords. But Canute didn't just favor Danes. He built strong relations with the English church and had himself recognized as God's chosen king. And then he also took the Danish throne. In 1018, he took control of his father's former kingdom, so England and Denmark were united. But Canute's eyes were set even higher. In 1028, he conquered Norway, bringing together three great kingdoms. Now, Canute was the king of England, Denmark, and Norway. Historians call this Canute's North Sea Empire. A vast Viking empire was born, stretching across Scandinavia, the British Isles, and northern Europe. My child, the Vikings once burned and pillaged Europe, but under Canute's rule, they had become rulers themselves. Law and order. Canute won the people's trust by upholding English laws. Christianization. He helped the Vikings be seen not as raiders, but as civilization builders. In economy and trade, he strengthened trade between England, Scandinavia, and Europe. Alliances with European kings. Canute formed an alliance with the Holy Roman Emperor, making him a part of European politics. Child, Canute wasn't just a warrior, he was a king, a diplomat, and a statesman. But what did we say, child? Time changes everything. When Canute died in 1035, the Viking Empire began to crumble. His sons couldn't maintain the order he'd built. Norway, Denmark, and England separated once again. The Viking dominance over Europe started to fade. But the legacy of King Canute the Great lives on, my child. His reign showed that the Vikings weren't just barbaric warriors. They could also be great rulers who built empires. And perhaps the last great ruler of the Viking Age was King Canute.
My child, when the Vikings first came onto the stage of history, everyone saw them as brutal sea warriors. But under Canute's rule, the Vikings became rulers who measured up to the great kingdoms of Europe.
That was their final great rise, and slowly the Viking Age began to come to an end. A son, kid, every age has its end. Just like the sun rises and sets, the Viking Age was bound to come to an end one day. The fearless warriors who once set fire to the shores of Europe and conquered kingdoms across the seas had now lost their old power. But it wasn't through battle that this happened. It came through a shift in belief, a transformation, and the inevitable passage of time. Today I'll tell you the story of how the Vikings faded into the dusty pages of history. The Vikings were a pagan people. Their gods were Thor, who thundered across the sky, Odin, who watched over the world with wisdom, and Freya, who carried the fiery spirit of war within her. They lived with strength and courage, dreaming of joining warriors in Valhalla. But that belief slowly began to change under the pressure of a new religion. It all started during the Vikings' raids across Europe. Their encounters with Christian people in France, England, and Germany began to change the Vikings. At first, Christian priests tried to convert the Vikings to their faith, but they stubbornly held on to their old gods for a long time. But sometimes politics and power can be sharper than the sword, kid. The European kingdoms began to unite against those who weren't Christian. The Vikings were now seen not just as raiders, but as barbaric pagans. It became harder to even trade with them. This was one of the first breaking points. The first big change came when King Harald Bluethen Gormson of Denmark accepted Christianity. In the mid-10th century, Harald converted Denmark and parts of Norway to Christianity. That was a major turning point. If you're wondering why Harald made such a decision, kid, it wasn't just about faith. The great powers of Europe were starting to see non-Christians as enemies. Harald chose to become Christian to secure Denmark's position in Europe. And then this change spread quickly. King Olaf Tryggvason of Norway 995-1000 outlawed pagan beliefs and forced Norwegians to convert to Christianity. King Olaf Skotkonung of Sweden also embraced Christianity, accelerating the end of paganism in Scandinavia. In 1030, King Olaf Haraldsson of Norway was killed, but his death ensured the establishment of Christianity. Thus, the Viking world began to drift away from their old gods and toward a new faith. But kid, changing a belief changes the soul of a people. The Vikings' greatest strength was their independence and clan systems. But as kings grew more powerful, the role of individual warriors started to fade. In the past, any free man could build his own ship, lead his own raids, and shape his own destiny. But as strong kings emerged, Viking society became more organized and controlled. Local chiefs lost their power and had to obey the king's commands. Viking warriors, instead of acting on their own, became part of armies. Independent pirate raids were banned because kings wanted order and stability. And so, the Viking spirit began to fade within a structured state system. Kid, remember, the Vikings' greatest advantage was that their enemies were weak. But by the 11th century, Europe had started to change. The kingdoms that once had been helpless against Viking raids now had powerful armies and walls to protect themselves. England was now ruled by the Duchy of Normandy and had a strong military structure. France built castles and walls to fend off Viking raids. The Holy Roman Empire set up strong order to stop the Vikings. Now the Vikings could no longer easily plunder their old enemies.
Instead, the Vikings turned to trade. The lands they once took by sword were now bought with gold. The warriors became traders.
Kid, the year 1066 is officially considered the end of the Viking Age. That year, England saw a great battle, the Battle of Hastings. King Harald Hardrada of Norway launched an invasion of England, but was killed at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. And just a few weeks later, Duke William of Normandy conquered England, but William wasn't a Viking. He was of Viking descent, but now a French noble. This showed that the Vikings were no longer the conquerors of Europe, and thus an age that once shook the seas came to an end. Kid, did the Vikings really disappear? No, they came back in a different form. The Normans were a new power, descended from the Vikings, but now European nobles. The Scandinavian countries became kingdoms and became part of Europe. Old Viking warriors now fought as mercenaries in kings' armies. The Viking Age was over, but the Vikings' legacy lived on forever. Even today, their descendants live in Scandinavian lands, and their stories continue to be whispered by the winds of the seas. And remember, kid, sometimes a people wins, not with a sword, but with change. That's what the Vikings did. Ah, my child, the flow of history is like an unstoppable storm at times, and the year 1066 was exactly the year when such a storm raged. An era was coming to an end, but the descendants of the Vikings were stepping up for one final great victory. This is the story not just of a battle, but of one of the turning points in European history. Who was William, my child? Today we know him as William the Conqueror, but his story is proof of how the descendants of the Vikings carried on the legacy of their ancestors. A century before, the The Vikings who raided the lands of the Frankish kingdom could never have imagined that one day the king himself would make a deal with them. In 911, Viking leader Rollo made a pact with the Frankish king and was declared Duke of Normandy. And here comes William, the grandson of Rollo.
He was no longer a Viking raider, but the blood of his ancestors who crossed seas and brought kingdoms to their knees ran through his veins. He was not just a Duke of Normandy, he was destined to be a conqueror. My child, there are certain years in history that changed the fate of a nation, and 1066 was such a year for England. That year, King Edward the Confessor of England died, and his death left the throne vacant. 3 major leaders went to war to claim the throne. Harold Godwinson, the new king of England, but his claim to the throne was disputed. Harold Hardrada, the king of Norway, who claimed the old Viking rights to England. William, Duke of Normandy, who claimed Edward had promised him the throne. First, Harald Hardrada attacked England with a great Viking army. But at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, King Harold Godwinson defeated him and killed him. But, my child, victory can sometimes be a curse, because Harold Godwinson's army was exhausted from fighting the Norwegians. And just at that moment, the Norman armies were landing on the shores of England. October 14, 1066, one of the most important battles in history took place near Hastings. On one side, King Harold Godwinson of England and his battle-worn army. On the other side, the Norman army led by William the Conqueror. My child, the Normans were masters of war. They would charge quickly with their cavalry, then retreat to trap the English. With their archers, they would break enemy lines, and then their infantry would finish the assault. The English were brave, but they struggled against the Norman tactics, and at the most critical moment of the battle, Harold Godwinson was struck in the eye by an arrow and killed. With his death, the English army fell apart, and that day became the day when England was conquered by the Normans. William the Conqueror was crowned King of England on December 25th, 1066 at Westminster Abbey. He was now King William I of England. But my child, this wasn't just a conquest, it meant that England would change completely. The Normans reshaped England's system of governance. They introduced the feudal system, overthrowing the English lords and replacing them with Norman nobles. English culture blended with Norman French culture. That's why 1066 wasn't just a victory, it was a turning point that changed the history of Europe. Now, I ask you, my child, did the Viking Age really come to an end? Perhaps Viking raiders were no longer seen on the seas. Perhaps there were no longer men wielding Thor's hammer in battle. But the Viking blood lived on through the Normans. The Normans were once Vikings, but now they were among the most powerful nobles in Europe. By conquering England, the Normans forever changed European history. And the descendants of the Normans, from France to England, even through the Crusades, wrote history all over again. My child, nothing in history ever completely disappears. Even when a civilization ends, its legacy continues under another name, in another form. And that's what the Vikings did. My child, the Viking Age may have ended, but their courage, warrior spirit, and legacy lived on through the Normans. History, like the waves at sea, constantly changes. When one wave pulls back, another comes in its place. The Normans took the Vikings' place. And the Normans created a new Europe. But remember, great people and great civilizations are remembered not just for conquering lands, but for the legacy they leave behind. And And the Vikings, they will never be forgotten. Now, close your eyes and listen to the waves of the sea, because every wave whispers the story of those great warriors who once sailed their ships across the oceans.